Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where everything smelled faintly of smoke, sweat, and old bread. The Middle Ages, it's the era that somehow produced both cathedrals and plague. It's a time when blacksmiths worked miracles with bellows and brute force, and yet, nobody had invented the concept of soap that wasn't made with lie and despair. So, if you've ever stared sadly at your premium stainless steel pan after 2 months of rust freckles, you might wonder, why do museum swords and medieval nails still look surprisingly good, even after 800 years underground? Did they know some secret formula? Was there medieval sorcery involved? Or is it, as usual, that we modern people are terrible at keeping anything nice for more than a week? Let's find out. And don't worry, no pop quizzes, no metallurgy exams. Just slow, sleepy, meandering through the smoky forges of history. The iron that wouldn't die. The secret, as it turns out, isn't entirely mystical. Medieval blacksmiths weren't chemists. They were patient, sweaty magicians of the mundane. Their iron, called wrought iron, was forged by hand, beaten repeatedly while white hot, and full of tiny impurities that modern engineers would consider horrifying. And yet, those imperfections were the key. Each hammer strike forced out bits of slag, the dark, glassy byproduct of smelting. But not all of it. Some slag got trapped, forming microscopic streaks through the metal like ribbons of black glass. And those ribbons, against all expectations, became natural barriers to corrosion. Essentially, medieval iron made itself rust-resistant by accident, because of course it did. When modern metallurgists spend millions to develop stainless alloys, medieval peasants with hammers were already halfway there through sheer, repetitive exhaustion. The rhythm of the forge. If you stood near a medieval forge, you'd hear a rhythm that was almost musical. The bellows groaned, feeding air into the charcoal. The iron hissed, glowing white like a fragment of the sun. And somewhere in the flickering orange light, a blacksmith, broad-backed and mostly deaf, would strike the same bar again and again, folding it like bread dough, welding layers by sheer force and faith. There were no thermometers, no protective eyewear, just intuition and occasionally mild heat stroke. The repetition was its own kind of meditation. Every strike refined the metal a little more, removing slag here, sealing cracks there, and compacting the whole structure into something that would outlast the blacksmith, his descendants, and, in some cases, entire kingdoms. Because when your life expectancy is 35, but your work survives for 1,000 years, that's not bad job security. Rust, nature's slow revenge rust, or iron oxide, is the universe's gentle reminder that everything man-made will return to dust eventually. But medieval iron fought back. The slag inclusions I mentioned earlier, they created tiny layers of silicon and phosphorus oxides, stable compounds that actually sealed off the iron underneath. So when rain hit the surface, it didn't bite deeply. It just stained it reddish-brown, like a faint blush rather than a death sentence. Contrast that with modern steel, pure, precise, ruthlessly refined. Modern steel is too perfect. Its uniform crystal structure lets rust spread like gossip in a medieval court. We purified away all the messy, self-protective slag layers, and in doing so, we made our iron vulnerable, which, honestly, feels like the most human thing we could have done. The smiths of secrets. We often romanticize medieval blacksmiths as mystical craftsmen, and while most were just trying not to starve, a few really did become legendary. There was Wayland the smith in Norse mythology, a craftsman so gifted that kings kidnapped him, which, to be fair, was how most medieval job offers worked. There was Masamune in Japan, whose blades were said to slice through water without disturbing it. And there were countless nameless smiths across Europe, whose work adorned cathedrals and crowned kings, but who themselves were buried without so much as a gravestone. They didn't know what irons might look like under a microscope. They didn't have microscopes, after all. They knew it by sound, by color, by the way a blade sang when struck against an anvil. It's an almost poetic irony that the most durable metalwork in history was created, not through theory, but through rhythm, intuition, and a kind of slow, glowing faith of knights in rusty armor. You might be imagining shining knights in spotless plate armor, the kind that sparkles under sunlight as they trot dramatically through mud. Reality, as usual, was less flattering. Armor did rust, constantly. It was polished endlessly by servants or, for lower-ranked soldiers, by the unfortunate owners themselves. The average knight spent almost as much time maintaining his gear as he did using it. And in rainy climates like England, where everything eventually smells of damp sheep, rust was the eternal enemy. But the interesting part is that the iron armor, particularly older pieces, aged better than many later steel ones. Because medieval iron, though crude, aged gracefully. It corroded slowly, unevenly, but rarely catastrophically. Steel, especially the later carbon-heavy types, could snap like a biscuit if mistreated. Iron bent, warped, scarred, but survived. Rather like the knights themselves, royal iron, the symbolic metal of kings, being kings, naturally took credit for metallurgy they didn't understand. Iron became symbolic, the metal of strength. Charlemagne was said to wield a sword of unbreakable iron, though in reality it was likely pattern-welded steel with a decorative name and a lot of myth attached. The English crown even minted coins in iron during desperate times, though they rusted so fast that people preferred barter. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, rulers like Stephen the Great supposedly carried iron maces as symbols of divine judgment, though one suspects the divine part was mostly marketing. Royal courts often displayed massive iron chains or gates as proof of power, because if there's one thing kings have always loved, it's taking credit for the work of people who actually know what they're doing. The alchemists' obsession while blacksmiths worked with iron, alchemists dreamed about it. To them, metals weren't just materials, they were living things. Stages in a cosmic evolution. Lead was young, base, and crude. Gold was mature, divine perfection. Iron was somewhere in between, the rebellious middle child. Medieval alchemists thought iron was the metal of Mars, the god of war, strong, volatile, and corrupted by earthly fire. They believed, with the right mixture of mystery and mercury, they could transmute it into gold. Of course, they couldn't, but their experiments, the careful heating, the endless stirring, the half-successes and occasional explosions laid the groundwork for chemistry. So, in a way, their obsession with iron rusting less and glowing more did change the world, just not in the way they expected. A tale of two irons. It's worth noting that not all medieval iron was equal. Northern Europe used bog iron, literal lumps of ore formed in swamps. The Vikings mined it by wading into wetlands and digging up rusted lumps of clay, then smelting them in clay furnaces that looked more like oversized bread ovens than industrial works. It was dirty work, and the product was unreliable. One batch might forge into a blade fit for a king. The next might crumble like a burnt biscuit. Southern Europe, meanwhile, had access to better ore from places like the Iberian Peninsula, where Roman mines still yielded high-quality hematite and magnetite. This produced denser, more resilient iron that resisted corrosion even better. So, when archaeologists dig up a Viking axe that still holds shape after 1,000 years, it's not magic, it's chemistry, climate, and a bit of luck. Asterisk. The modern curse of progress. Fast forward to today. We have better technology, better alloys, controlled furnaces, and yet your car door is bubbling with rust after one rainy winter. That's because modern manufacturing optimizes for cost and efficiency, not immortality. We produce steel by the megaton, not by the hammer strike. It's standardized, precise, and heartbreakingly fragile compared to its ancient cousin. Our ancestors made iron slowly, often over days, sometimes weeks. Each batch was unique, almost organic. We make it in minutes, and it dies in years. There's something quietly poetic about that our age of convenience, for all its brilliance, can't seem to make a door hinge last as long as a 13th century church gate. Let's drift on. So, the next time you see an old wrought iron fence, twisted and dark but still standing proud after centuries, you're looking at more than just metal. You're looking at the rhythm of a forgotten forge, at a craftsman who worked by instinct, whose sweat became part of the structure, at a kind of immortality achieved not by perfection, but by imperfection done beautifully. We moderns, for all our stainless marvels, have lost that slow patience. We make things that shine brightly, then crumble quietly. Medieval iron just endures, not flawless, not stainless, just stubborn. And maybe that's the lesson worth taking to sleep tonight. That sometimes the best protection isn't purity, it's texture, imperfection, and a bit of soot. Asterisk. Tonight, we're drifting back to the narrow, grimy alleys of the medieval world, a place where everything smelled faintly of smoke, cabbage, and regret. It's the 14th century. Give or take a few plagues. The streets are muddy, the air is thick, and the concept of public hygiene is still several centuries away from even being a rumor. But amid this fragrant chaos, there walks a quiet, necessary figure, the medieval rat catcher. He's not glamorous. He's not noble. He's not even especially clean. But he is, somehow, indispensable. Because when half your city's economy depends on grain, and the other half depends on pretending not to notice the fleas in your bedding, someone has to keep the rats in check. So, let's ease into the dim streets of a medieval town, where the night air hums with distant church bells, and something skittering softly in the straw. A profession no one wanted, but everyone needed. Being a rat catcher was never anyone's first career choice. No one woke up in 1320 thinking, I shall dedicate my life to pest control. It was more often the kind of job you stumbled into when every other door, baker, cooper, monk, had already closed. If you were quick, quiet, and had a certain tolerance for things with tails, you might find a niche here. Rat catchers were essential to towns and castles alike. Rats weren't just nuisances. They were small, gnawing disasters, eating grain stores, spoiling flour, spreading disease, and occasionally biting through things like parchment or sleeping servants. And yet, despite their importance, rat catchers occupied the lowest rungs of society. They were tolerated, paid irregularly, and often regarded with mild disgust, much like the animals they hunted. Still, the job came with a peculiar kind of power. A rat catcher could wander freely where others could not, into storerooms, kitchens, cellars, even noble quarters if things got desperate. They were invisible servants to everyone, but essential to everything. Tools of the trade-day medieval rat catcher's kit were simple, and often terrifyingly improvised. He might carry a wooden club for crushing, a net for catching, and a small sack of something toxic, perhaps arsenic or ground-up herbs. Poison was the luxury version of pest control, and not every rat catcher could afford it. More commonly, he relied on traps, crude but effective contraptions made of iron wire or spring-loaded wood. The more enterprising ones even bred ferrets or terriers, trained to sniff and chase their quarry into corners. Sometimes he'd carry a whistle, not for dramatic flair, but to call his animals. A rat catcher and his ferret were a team, bonded by mutual distrust and the occasional shared meal. And yes, occasionally, the rat catcher would keep live rats in cages. To demonstrate his services, of course. He'd parade them through the marketplace, letting the crowd see what kind of danger they faced. Then he'd theatrically dispatch a few, collect his payment, and move on before the smell caught up. It was a dirty performance art, half commerce, half showmanship, the smell of survival. Let's talk about hygiene. Briefly, the medieval rat catcher did not, by most standards, smell good. Neither did anyone else. But he had his own unique bouquet, a mixture of straw dust, old leather, and the faintly metallic tang of rat. His clothes were patched and stained, sometimes deliberately to mask blood or filth. He worked by torchlight in cramped alleys and storerooms filled with grain dust and squeaks. Occasionally, he'd work at night, creeping along the walls of bakeries or granaries, setting traps by feel alone. And yet, oddly enough, his appearance could inspire both disgust and superstition. Some thought rat catchers were half wizards, men who whispered charms to drive vermin away. Others suspected they brought the rats themselves, releasing them first and catching them later for profit. It was a fine line between pest control and black magic. Many rat catchers wisely leaned into the reputation. After all, fear is good for business. The medieval pest epidemic rats were not new. They had followed humanity since the dawn of stored grain. But medieval Europe gave them their paradise. Crowded cities, overflowing refuse, and warehouses full of edible chaos. By the 13th century, rats had become a fixture in every town, castle, monastery, and ship. Grain bins were their banquet halls, barns were their playgrounds, and sewers were home. The black rat, rattus, particularly thrived in warm attics and lofts, which meant they often lived above people's sleeping heads. A comforting thought, if you enjoy historical authenticity in your nightmares. And when the plague arrived in the mid-1300s, carried by fleas that lived on those very rats, the rat catcher's role took on a grim new importance. Suddenly, everyone wanted them, and no one wanted to touch them. It's difficult to imagine now, but in plague years, being a rat catcher could make you both a savior and a suspect. If you survived, people assumed you had supernatural protection. If you died, well, it was about time. Payment in coin, bread, or beer. Rat catchers were rarely They worked on commission, paid by the tail, the pelt, or sometimes by the rat itself. In wealthier towns, councils hired official pest controllers, but in villages, it was a freelance affair. A farmer might pay with a jug of ale. A miller might offer a sack of barley. A monastery might promise prayers, which, while spiritually enriching, didn't buy much dinner. A few lucky ones worked directly for noble households. Castles, after all, had cellars, and cellars had rats. If your job was to protect the duke's wine from infestation, you were more valuable than a scribe, and nearly as expendable as a jester. Still, for all the danger and disgust, some rat catchers earn steady livelihoods. There are records from Germany and France of rat catchers appearing in civic roles, humble but official. They were the maintenance men of medieval urban life, ensuring that at least some of the food made it to the table unnibbled. Tricks of the trade rats are clever. Cleverer than they look, and often cleverer than their human counterparts. So a good rat catcher had to think like one. He learned to study their habits, how they ran along walls, where they nested, what smells they avoided. He could tell, from the faintest trail of droppings, how many rats had passed and which direction they went. Some even claimed to know rat dialects, the high squeaks of warning, the lower chatter of contentment. It's hard to verify that, but the idea adds a certain romance to the filth, doesn't it? A lonely figure crouched in the dark, whispering softly to his enemies to lure them. He might use bits of bread, bacon, or cheese. Poison was often made from herbs like hellebore or aconite, plants that could kill both rat and human with equal enthusiasm. Sometimes mixtures included dried fish and lye, which worked spectacularly well if you didn't mind accidentally poisoning half your household staff. It was a crude science, but it worked, mostly. The rat catcher as folk figure over time. The rat catcher became a kind of archetype, half villain, half necessary evil in medieval festivals and plays. He might appear as a ragged figure carrying a bag of squeaking rats, warning townsfolk of doom. He symbolized both the corruption of the city and the thin line between order and chaos. Rats were more than pests, they were omens, and the man who controlled them was never entirely trusted. This cultural unease eventually produced one of Europe's strangest folk tales, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Though the tale likely arose centuries later, it echoed the same unease. A rat catcher who could charm vermin, and then, in a fit of vengeance, charm away the town's children. Asterisk. It's a grim moral lesson wrapped in a fable about payment due, and perhaps a faint echo of all those underpaid, unappreciated men who risked disease daily to make medieval life slightly less unbearable. Rat catchers and the plaguelets drift for a moment into 1348, the year the Black Death first reached Europe. Within months, towns were drowning in corpses. Priests fled, doctors died, and cats were slaughtered in misguided attempts to stop the spread. The rats, meanwhile, flourished. Rat catchers found themselves in extraordinary demand, though few lived long enough to enjoy the profits. Some took to wearing long leather coats and masks soaked in vinegar, crude forerunners of the later plague doctor costume. Others simply accepted that fate had sharp teeth and carried on trapping. After the first wave, cities like London began experimenting with new rules: fines for dirty streets, payments for rat tails, and early forms of waste management. The rat catcher's job shifted from superstition to proto-science. He became, however accidentally, one of the first urban hygienists. It's almost poetic. The man most despised for filth helped lay the groundwork for cleanliness. A day in the life, picture it. Dawn in a small English town. The air is damp. The bells are tolling for matins, and somewhere a rat catcher is already awake. He begins in the grain warehouses, checking his traps, shaking out the limp bodies, resetting the snares. The air smells of mold and candle smoke. He mutters a prayer, mostly out of habit, and moves on to the baker's shop. Rats love bakeries, warm, full of flour, and never short on crumbs by midday. He's in the marketplace, displaying his day's catch, a macabre advertisement that no one really wants to look at. He collects a few coins, maybe a loaf, maybe a By evening, he's back in the alleys, crouched in the dark with his ferret, listening for the tiny, familiar rustle. It's not a glamorous life, but it's steady, and there's something almost meditative about it, the rhythm of survival. He doesn't expect gratitude. He expects payment, occasionally, and sleep, rarely. The quiet legacy, the rat catcher, faded slowly as cities modernized. By the 1600s, the title lingered mostly as an insult or a folk tale. Rat catcher became shorthand for the lowest of the low, but their work continued in new forms. The early exterminators, the city inspectors, the public health workers, and oddly enough, some of their methods remain recognizable. Modern pest control still uses bait, traps, and studied patterns of movement. The difference is mostly branding. Today's rat catcher wears gloves, a uniform, and carries a logo, but in spirit, he's the same, a solitary figure, working in the quiet corners where no one else wants to go, holding back the tide of small, relentless teeth. So the next time you see a rat dart across a subway track, imagine its ancestor crouched under a medieval bakery, and the man who hunted it by candlelight with a bag, a stick, and just enough courage to keep the world from falling apart. Because sometimes history's unsung heroes aren't kings or knights. They're the ones who kept the bread edible. Tonight. We're drifting back to a time when the night sky was truly dark, and the only light came from the moon. A few guttering candles, and the occasional burning barn. It's the Middle Ages, somewhere between the 12th and 15th centuries. That oddly specific period when Europe was perpetually made of wood and dreams, both highly flammable. Cities were cramped, roofs were thatched, walls were timber, and heating involved setting controlled fires directly inside your house. Because of course it did. In this world, one profession stood quietly in the background, watching over the sleeping city. The fire watcher. He wasn't glamorous. He wasn't rich. He was, however, the thin and often hungover line between civilization and a very large pile of ashdot. So tonight, we'll wander the narrow lanes of medieval towns, where torches flicker, people snore under rough wool blankets, and somewhere in the distance, a bellman's staff taps softly against the stones, marking the watch. Keeping an eye on the embers, the ever-present fear of fire. It's difficult for us, in our world of sprinkler systems and fire codes, to imagine how constant the fear of fire was in medieval life. If you lived in a medieval town, say, London, Lubeck, or Bruges, you were effectively living inside one large tinderbox. Walls were timber frames packed with straw and clay. Roofs were thatched with reeds. Floors were covered in Russia's dried plant stalks, occasionally refreshed, with herbs to hide the smell of whatever the dog had done that week. Every single home had an open hearth. Cooking fires, tallow candles, oil lamps, all dancing merrily beside wooden furniture, draped cloth, and sleeping livestock. And that's before we even mentioned the workshops. Blacksmiths, brewers, bakers, all keeping roaring flames burning through the night, often tended by apprentices who, statistically speaking, were about 12 and easily distracted by shiny things. So when a city caught fire, it wasn't a fire. It was an event. Entire districts could vanish in hours. Records of medieval fires read like the world's most depressing weather reports. Cologne, 1085, burned. Winchester, 1141, burned. London several times, burned, rebuilt, burned again. There's something almost comforting about the consistency, the birth of the fire watch at some point. City councils realized that relying on divine mercy wasn't a sustainable fire prevention strategy, so they hired men or occasionally drafted them to patrol through the night, watching for any suspicious glow or suspiciously asleep blacksmith. These were the fire watchers. Their job was simple: stay awake, walk the streets, and sound the alarm at the first sign of smoke. In theory, at least. In practice, they were a curious mix of civic servants, night guards, and professional busybodies. They carried lanterns and long poles, sometimes tipped with hooks, to tear thatch from burning roofs, and little handbells to raise the alarm. They'd walk slow circuits through the city, calling out the hour and, occasionally, muttering moral advice. 10 o'clock and all's well, they'd say, which was optimistic, given that medieval wellness often included rats, dysentery, and a contagious bishop somewhere. A night on the watch, picture it, a cold night in late autumn. The cobblestones are slick with rain. The air smells of damp straw and wood smoke. The town is dark, utterly dark, except for a few orange dots of light where shutters don't quite close. Through the mist walks a fire watcher. He's wrapped in a coarse cloak, carrying a horn and a lantern shielded from the wind. His boots slapped quietly on the stones. Every hour he stops to strike his staff against the ground, a signal to the next man along the route that he's still alive and more or less awake. He glances up at the roofs, the thatch wet from the rain. Thank heaven. He listens for the sounds that matter: the crackle of fire, the rush of wind, the sudden panic of geese. And if everything's quiet, he mutters a prayer, adjusts his hood, and keeps walking. It's not a glorious job. It's cold, it's dull, and you're paid roughly the same as a baker's assistant, without the added benefit of bread. But it carries a strange dignity, because when the alarm bell does ring, you're the one who has to run toward the flames. Asterisk how fires were fought. There were no hoses, no engines, no brave teams in helmets when fire struck. The medieval method of firefighting was essentially panic, pray, and demolish your neighbor's house before the fire reached yours. Buckets of water were passed hand to hand, from wells or fountains. Hooks and axes were used to tear down roofs, creating fire breaks. Church bells rang to wake the town, and every able-bodied person, men, women, and occasionally highly motivated dogs, joined in. The fire watcher, in the middle of this chaos, had two responsibilities. First, raise the alarm. Second, try not to die. They would run through the streets, shouting, "Fire! Fire!" ringing bells, banging on doors, dragging people out of bed. And if the fire was large enough, the entire town might turn out, half-dressed and half-panicked, forming long bucket lines while priests blessed the air and people dumped chamber pots on the flames, hoping quantity might compensate for quality. It rarely worked, but sometimes it was enough to contain the damage, to save one street, one church, one granary. And in those moments, the humble fire watcher became the accidental hero of the night. Asterisk, asterisk. Now, the line wasn't unique to Dodge City. Every cattle town had one. Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, all the same story. A wave of young, lonely cowboys would drive their herds north from Texas for months at a time, get paid in a lump sum, and immediately try to spend every cent before someone smarter took it from them. So the red light districts grew up naturally, the economic answer to supply and demand. And because this was the American West, everyone liked to pretend it was all very spontaneous. But of course, nothing ever is dot. Behind every saloon girl and madam was a network of landlords, gamblers, and lawmen quietly taking a cut. And Dodge City's lawmen, including Wyatt Earp himself, were surprisingly comfortable with it. So long as no one shot anyone important, the red light district could stay. The most famous madam in town was Dora Hand. She was beautiful by 1870 standards, which meant she probably had teeth and didn't die of cholera. Dora was a former actress, a soprano who could carry a tune loud enough to rise above a piano that had seen better years and worse tuning. She came to Dodge in 1878, running a saloon called the Lady Gay. Yes, that was the real name. Subtlety was not the frontier's strong suit. Dora had an odd sort of charm about her. She wasn't cruel like many madams, nor desperate like her girls. People liked her. Even the lawmen, especially one particular lawman, James Dog Kelly, Dodge's mayor at the time. He adored her, which, as it often did in the Old West, turned out badly, because one night, a drunk cowboy named James Kennedy, son of a Texas cattle baron, and therefore immune to good sense, came to the Lady Gay looking for attention. Dora sensibly refused him so. He did what every spoiled young man in the 19th century seemed to think was romantic. He got his rifle, rode to her house at night, and fired through her window. The bullet missed Kelly, but it struck Dora. She died instantly. It was, of course, a tragedy, but not an unusual one. Violence in the red light district rarely made the papers unless it was spectacularly inconvenient. The local papers mourned her as a lady of refinement and good taste, which was their polite way of saying she was too charming to be ridden off as a prostitute, and then, like so many women in frontier towns, she vanished from memory, replaced by the next wave of bright-eyed girls who thought Dodge would be glamorous. Let's drift a little further down the line, past the Lady Gay, past the rowdy saloons with poetic names like the Alhambra and the Long Branch. Here, you'd find the cribs. They weren't called that because anyone was sleeping comfortably. A crib was a one-room shack, sometimes barely wider than a horse stall, where a woman would live and work, usually both at once. The girls who ended up here were often the poorest, the youngest, or the most desperate. Some had followed cattle drives north, others had run from something worse. Many were simply abandoned. They charged anywhere from 25 cents to $2, depending on the hour, the customer, and the state of the wallpaper. And yet, even here, in these grim little rooms, a kind of community formed. The women looked after one another when they could. They shared meals, sewing needles, and occasional laughter. When one got sick, others chipped in for medicine or whiskey, which was the same thing if you were poor enough. They were the unacknowledged backbone of the frontier economy, and everyone knew it. Of course, that didn't stop the hypocrisy. The same men who railed against immorality by day were frequent customers by night. Preachers held revival meetings within earshot of dance halls. City councils passed anti-vice ordinances only to quietly collect fines from the same women the next morning. It was, in essence, a cycle of sin and taxation. The town needed the money, the women needed the work, and everyone needed to pretend. It was temporary, in a way. Dodge City's red light district mirrored the entire mythology of the Wild West freedom, with consequences. Glamour built on exhaustion. The women were entrepreneurs in the most brutal economy imaginable. They managed payrolls, bribed officials, and even organized primitive forms of healthcare. Some, like Big Nose Kate Doc Holliday's, often Don Companion, became legends in their own right. Kate was Hungarian by birth, educated and fluent in multiple languages, which, naturally, led her to a career in the Kansas sex trade. She met Holliday in Dodge, and together they drank, gambled, and bickered their way into Western folklore. When she wasn't tending to Doc's tuberculosis fits, she was likely relieving a drunk cowboy of his paycheck at Polka Dot. She was, by all accounts, a woman who took absolutely no nonsense, and she had to be. The red light district may have been tolerated, but it was never safe. Women were robbed, beaten, or worse, with alarming regularity. The lawmen, those mythic figures in long dusters, often looked the other way, unless the trouble was loud enough to wake the respectable part of town. It's easy, from the distance of a century, to see Dodge City's vice district as some romantic blur of flickering lamplight and dusty glamour. But the reality was much quieter. Most nights weren't shootouts or wild dances. They were nights of waiting for customers, for money, for morning. Some girls would sit on the front steps, smoking and humming to themselves. Others played cards until they couldn't keep their eyes open. Outside, the cattle cars creaked and shifted in the stockyards. The air smelled like dust and sweat and old wood. It was, in its own strange way, peaceful. Every few years, someone would try to clean it all up. The city council would declare a moral reform, usually under pressure from local church groups or visiting wives. The saloons would close early. The cribs would be raided. A few unlucky women would be paraded through the streets for show. And then, when the tourists got bored and the cowboys came back, everything reopened again. The moral crusades never lasted long. Dodge City's economy ran on vice. Without the red light district, the town would have collapsed. So everyone simply agreed not to talk about it too loudly. Eventually, the cattle drives stopped. The railroad expanded. The open range gave way to fences, and the cowboys moved on. Dodge City, without its rowdy customers, became just another sleepy Kansas town. The red light district faded, building by building, until nothing remained but foundations under the prairie grass. A few madams moved east, reinventing themselves as boarding house owners. Others married respectably, pretending not to remember where the money had come from, and the women who didn't survive were quietly buried on Boot Hill, unmarked, unmentioned, but not forgotten, because, in a strange way, they were the ones who kept the town alive long enough for everyone else to pretend it was civilized. So tonight, as we drift to sleep, maybe think about that quiet part of Dodge City history, the lamplight glowing in a dusty window, the faint echo of laughter carried on the wind, and the unspoken truth that every respectable frontier town had its foundation in scandal. The red light district wasn't just a place. It was the heartbeat of a time when civilization was a performance, and everyone, in their own way, was pretending. Let's drift further into that world. where vice paid the bills, and virtue was just a matter of geography. Asterisk.